Welcome to another study in the book of Genesis chapter 7. We're looking at Joseph's jealousy and betrayal. Remember, the Bible's a library of 66 books, so it's a complete story from beginning to end. Joseph is the next famous Bible character in line. Jacob, one of Isaac's twin sons, eventually became the father of 12 sons. Among these 12 was Joseph, one of the best known men of the Bible. We find him in relationship to the other historical nations around about in these outlines. Joseph was famous for his dream. The dream comes true, and then we see that Jacob moves to Egypt between chapters 37 and 50. There's a story, probably not true, but about a man who was a sole survivor of a ship which sank at sea. He made a small raft of some of the ship's cargo and eventually was able to drift to a desert island. Finally, he saw a ship approaching more closely and hurriedly set a signal fire ablaze. To his dismay, the ship passed by and was quickly fading from sight. Accidentally, sparks from the signal fire set the thatched roof of his shelter in flames, and the man watched hopelessly and helplessly as all of his provisions burned to ashes. All was lost, he reasoned. Life could not last much longer. Suddenly he noticed that the ship which had passed him by was actually turning round and approaching the island. To his great relief, he was seen by the crew and rescued. Once on board, the grateful survivor went to the captain to express his thanks. "What caused you to turn round after you had already passed me by?" he queried. "Why, we saw the signal fire you made by setting your shelter on fire," the captain said. The very thing which seemed to seal the doom of this marooned man was the means of his delivery. That's really precisely the case with Joseph and Jacob in Genesis chapter 37. A tragic and cruel event occurred which to Jacob brought his world to an end, he thought. Life was hardly worth living, he reasoned, because he'd lost the one thing which meant the most to him. But in the end, the loss of Joseph for a period of years was the means that God employed to save the nation from starvation and, worse yet, from a loss of purity by being absorbed into the culture and religion of the Canaanites. The emotional intensity of the events of this episode in the life of Jacob and his sons is perhaps difficult for us to appreciate. We come to the 37th chapter of Genesis in much the same way as we would watch the video replay of a week-old football match. We know the outcome of the story. We know that Jacob was in error when he later cried out, "All these things are against me." Only in the throes of crisis or tragedy can we fully appreciate what Jacob is experiencing in this chapter. Now Jacob lived in a land where his father had sojourned in the land of Canaan. These are the records of the generation of Jacob. Joseph, when 17 years of age, was pasturing the flock with his brothers while he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah, the sons of Zilpah, and father's wives. Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a vari-coloured tunic. His brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, and so they hated him and couldn't speak to him on friendly terms. Who was Joseph? The 11th son, but the first of Jacob and Rachel. What is the meaning of his name? Yahweh increases or adds. Where was he born? Mesopotamia, people of the East. Key word of his life, by faith. There's a tendency to regard the remaining chapters of Genesis as a story of Joseph, but this is not technically accurate. Moses referred to chapter 36 as the records of the generation of Esau. In Genesis 37:2, Moses entitled this section, the records of the generations of Jacob. We must not forget that Jacob will not pass off the scene until Genesis 49, where we find the account of his death. This last section then is an account of God's working in the life of Jacob and of his sons through the instrumentality of Joseph. Joseph is certainly the central figure in these chapters, but he's not the only figure. God forming a nation out of all the sons of Jacob. Joseph's sojourn in Egypt and his ultimate elevation to the post of Prime Minister. as supposed to Prime Minister under Pharaoh, makes possible the preservation of Jacob and his sons, as well as teaching all of them some valuable spiritual lessons. There is more space given about Joseph than any other character in the book of Genesis. This was a significant aspect of those from whom Moses was writing. God wants us to know about Joseph. Now Jacob lived in a land where his father had sojourned, in the land of Canaan. And here we see the background genealogy, right from Terah all the way through. So he called his name Joseph and said, "The Lord shall add to me another son," Rachel's firstborn. There are a number of contrasts and comparisons we see between Joseph and his father Jacob. Jacob, he was the youngest son. His name meant heel grabber. He was loved by his mother. He bought the birthright from his brother. He was hated by his oldest brother. As a result of his brother's threats, he travelled to Haran, and Haran he worked for Laban, and Jacob brought prosperity to Laban. Laban deceived Jacob. When Jacob left Laban, he was a rich man. Jacob became fearful as he anticipated meeting his brother again, and Jacob was eventually reconciled with his brother. Joseph, on the other hand, he was the youngest son. His name means to add. He was loved by his father. His father gave him the birthright over his older brothers. He was hated by his older brothers. As a result of his brother's plot, he was sold and taken to Egypt. In Egypt, he worked for Potiphar. Joseph brought prosperity to Potiphar. Potiphar was deceived by his wife. Joseph left Potiphar's prison and became the ruler of all Egypt. His brothers became fearful when they met Joseph again, and Joseph was eventually reconciled with his brothers. Joseph's story is a problem of favoritism, deception with garments and a goat, departure from the land of Egypt, in Egypt in the days of Joseph, Joseph's imprisonment, Joseph's exaltation, and Israel's entrance into Egypt are the things that the story will deal with. The corruption of Joseph's family. Joseph's family sins against him, chapter 37, 1 to 36, and Joseph's family sins with the Canaanites, 38, 1 to 30. The exaltation of Joseph, Joseph's test with the Egyptian woman, Joseph's test with Egyptian society, Joseph's test with Pharaoh's dreams, and Joseph's ultimate exaltation over Egypt. The salvation of Jacob's family. Joseph's brothers visit Egypt. Joseph dies in Egypt, and Jacob dies in Egypt. Joseph dies in Egypt. Joseph is the 11th of 12 children. He would have been only 6 years old when his family fled from their home in Haran. The family had come to Shechem. His sister had been raped there, and his brothers had gone in and murdered everyone in the city. Because of this, the family had to move again, and now they were near Bethel. He had seen 3 deaths in the extended family: his grandfather Isaac, his mother Rachel, a nurse named Deborah. In Genesis 37:2, this is the history of Joseph being 17 years old, feeding flock with his brothers. Lad was with the sons of Bilhah, sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. One of the great disservices we do to this text is to fail to grasp the fundamental cause of the animosity of Joseph's brothers towards him. Generally, we tend to think of Joseph as a small lad, 8 to 10 years of age, who tells tales on his big brothers. But that's hardly a crime which deserves death, and doesn't fit with the details of the account. Joseph is not 7 years old, but 17 years old. Now, in some senses, this is young, but in ancient Near East, girls of this age were often already married. For example, Dinah. Young men were not infrequently kings at this age. So it's far more likely that Joseph was rejected by his brothers because of the authority he exercised over them, even though he was their younger brother. 17 was not necessarily young for such authority, but he was younger than his older brothers, and this was indeed a bitter pill for them to swallow. To make matters worse, Jacob loved Joseph more than all his children and made it obvious. He made a coat of many colours. Because of this partiality, the older brothers resented Joseph, and that's not maybe as strong as it should be. Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. So he said to them, please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheaf arose, and also stood upright. And indeed your sheaves stood all round, and bowed down to my sheaf. His brother said, Shall you indeed reign over us? Shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed still another dream, and he told his brothers and said, Look, I have dreamed another dream. And this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bow down to me. So Joseph was a youthful dreamer, and we know that his dream came true. Genesis 41, the Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it in Joseph's hand. He clothed him in garments of fine linen and put gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a second chariot with him, and they cried out before him, Bow the knee. So they set him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, I am your Pharaoh. Without your consent, no man may lift his hand or foot in all of the land of Egypt. So Joseph's dreams ultimately came true. So due to these two sets of dreams, are set in the world in which he lived, an agricultural economy, and a life lived out under the sky and the stars. First one, in the field, brothers' sheaves bowed down to Joseph's sheaves, brothers moved down to Joseph. In second, in the sky, sun and moon and 11 stars bowed down to Joseph. Jacob and his wives and sons would bow down before Joseph. While the dream obviously comes from the Lord, we have to wonder at Joseph's lack of wisdom in sharing the contents of the dream with his brothers. On the other hand, this was a revelation from God, and as such was meant to be shared. There's a continuing refrain that we ought to have noticed throughout this chapter. It has now been repeated on 3 different occasions. It's a refrain of hatred. They hated him. They couldn't speak to him on friendly terms. They hated him even more. They hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. So the brothers said to him, Shall you indeed reign over us? You shall indeed have dominion over us. So they hated him even more for his dreams and his words. Hated because of the authority as well as the dreams. Grammatically, Joseph's authority is only permissible, but it's preferable. George Booth, author of the classic commentary on the book of Genesis, strongly holds the most literal and normal rendering of verse 2, of which he writes, tending or acting the shepherd over his brethren in the flock. However uncouth to our ears, the phraseology of this is undoubtedly the exact rendering and the import of the words. We take it to be that Joseph was charged with the superintendence of his brothers, particularly the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. After the sin of Reuben, Joseph was given the rights of the firstborn. Now the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, for he was firstborn, but because he defiled his father's bed, his birthright was given to sons of Joseph, the son of Israel, so that he is not enrolled in the genealogy according to the birthright. Though Judah prevailed over his brothers, and from him came the leader, yet the birthright belonged to Joseph. Well, it's not until chapter 49 that this transfer is formally stated by Jacob. The sin which precipitated it has already been recorded in Genesis 35. It's not unlikely that Jacob expressed his intentions much sooner than this to his sons, and even began to give Joseph preeminence over his brothers by this time. Further details seem to demonstrate this. Joseph's coat was a symbol of authority. It was granted over his brothers. Jacob's preference for Joseph was no secret. The coat his father gave him was regarded as evidence of Jacob's great love for Joseph above his other sons. Furthermore, this coat indicated more than preference. It symbolized preeminence and superiority of rank. No one really knows exactly what this coat looked like. Some have suggested that it differed from the coats of Joseph's brethren in that it had long sleeves, in which case it would mark out Joseph as like a white-collar worker, while his brothers were mere blue-collar workers. Just as supervisors are marked out today by the fact they wear suits, so we're told Joseph was set apart by his long-sleeved coat. The gift of a coat of many pieces or colours, or rather the tunic with sleeves, was about the most significant act that Jacob could have shown to Joseph. A coat, 2 Samuel 13:18, she had a garment of many colours on her, for with much robes. Psalm 45, the king's daughter is all glorious within, her clothing is of worked gold. Ezekiel 16, your garments you did take and decked your high places with colours, a coat made of stripes of different coloured cloth. It was a mark of distinction that carried its own meaning. It implied that exemption from labour, which was peculiar privilege of the heir or prince of the Eastern clan. The outer distinction which a father bestows upon his sons, long-sleeved cloth, is the undergarment or tunic, which usually was sleeveless, a thing usually of knee length. Instead of the ordinary workaday garment which had no sleeves and which by coming down to the knees only enabled men to get on work, this tunic with sleeves clearly marked out its wearer as a person of special distinction who was not required to do ordinary work. Pasim means ankles or wrists. Consequently, this tunic was sleeved and extended to the ankles. It was not therefore a garment adapted to work, but suitable to distinguish a superior or overseer, Griffin Thomas says. Not all the commentators agree. There is nothing in any of the texts where the term is used to indicate that the tunic had long sleeves or even was actually of many colours. The AV, coat of many colours, becomes only an attempt to give a meaning to the total term, Sliger says. Well, there's considerable conjecture on this matter of the coat. One thing is certain. The term which is used for Joseph's coat in this chapter occurs elsewhere in 2 Samuel, and there it is employed for the coat which was worn by Tamar, the daughter of David. She was a princess. While other things may have been symbolised by this garment, such as virginity, the coat was the evidence of royalty. In the context of our passage, it's easy to believe that Joseph's coat was considered to be symbolic of his authority, in the same manner as stripes and sleeve of a military uniform. Joseph's brothers hated this garment and what it symbolised, for the first act of violence was to strip his coat from him. The greatest antagonism towards Joseph was from the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, while the two brothers who attempted to release him, Reuben and Judah, were sons of Leah. Verse 2, Joseph was said to have pastured the flocks of Jacob, along with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah. Reuben and later Judah, sons of Leah, attempted to prevent or at least to modify the plan of the others to kill Joseph. A footnote in verse 2 in the margin of the Berkeley version suggests the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah would be less disciplined since they were sons of pagan mothers, while Leah and Rachel would reflect a relatively more godly training of Laban. If Joseph had been placed in a position of authority, a white-collar job by his father, then what could be more logical in a report to Jacob than the performance, efficiency and reliability of those under him? When Jacob asked Joseph to go to Shechem to check up on his sons and his flocks, he's not sending Joseph around the corner to spy upon and then tattle on his brothers. It was 50 miles or more to Shechem. It was 70 miles to Dothan. Since Shechem had been the scene of the slaughter of the men of that city years before, Jacob would not have taken such a task lightly. It was a kind of responsibility he would give only to one who had proved his capabilities as a leader. A sensitive and potentially dangerous mission would not be given to a son without reliability and authority. Joseph's report to his father would be a logical and necessary part of this function and authority as a supervisor. Joseph, 17, so this kind of sibling rivalry would be expected, but undeserving of such harsh countermeasures by Joseph's brothers. The intensity of Joseph's brothers' reaction to his dreams indicates there must have been some substance to their fears of Joseph assuming such great power and prominence. Joseph's brothers were deeply distressed by his two dreams. When the plot to kill him is first conceived, the dreams are a prominent part of their hostility and motivation. So Jacob sent son Joseph to check on his brothers. They were tending the sheep in Dothan, and when they saw him coming, they plotted to kill him. So Jacob's concern for the welfare of the family's flocks is not unfounded. Shechem was a city, remember, where Dinah had been taken by force and where Jacob's sons, especially Simeon and Levi, had slaughtered all the men. Since Jacob had purchased land there, it would not be unusual for him to make use of it by sending his flocks there to feed in its rich pasture land under the care of his sons. There was always the danger of some angry relative of one of those Shechemites who were killed or captured seeking vengeance, and this seems to be what Joseph was sent to look into. Joseph wandered about the fields of Shechem in search of his brothers. He departed, little knowing he would not see his father again for 22 years. It just so happened that a man found him who had further happened to see Joseph's brothers and overhear them saying that they were going to go on to Dothan. Not only did he give up his search and return to his father while completing his task, Joseph himself went on the extra 20 miles to Dothan. Animosity towards Joseph had continued to build up until the situation was quite explosive. Now it was only a matter of time and opportunity. That opportunity finally arrived when Jacob sent Joseph to Shechem. Then his brothers went to pasture their father's flock in Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock in Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." "I will go," Joseph said. Then he said to them, "Go now and see about the welfare of your brothers, the welfare of the flock, and bring word back to me." So he sent them to the valley of Hebron, and they came to Shechem, and a man found him. Behold, he was wandering in the field. The man says, "What are you looking for?" He said, "I'm looking for my brothers. Please tell me where they're pasturing the flock." The man said, "They've moved from here, for I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers, and he found them at Dothan. While at a considerable distance, Joseph was recognized by his brothers. They immediately conspired in a violent and daring plot which would rid them once and for all of their brother. When they saw him from a distance, and before he came close to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. And they said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Now then, come, let us kill him. Let's throw him into one of the pits, and we will say a wild beast devoured him. Then let us see what will become of his dreams." But Reuben heard this and rescued him out of their hands and said, "Let us not take his life." Reuben further said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into the pit that is in the wilderness, but do not lay hands on him." Reuben thought he might rescue him out of their hands to restore him to his father later. So it came about when Joseph reached his brothers that they stripped Joseph's tunic, the vari-coloured tunic that was on him. They took him and threw him into the pit. The pit was empty, without any water in it, thankfully. It was probably Joseph's coat that made it possible to identify him so quickly from such a distance. It may also have been that coat which triggered the pent-up feelings of jealousy and hostility towards the beloved son of their father. They saw the great distance from their father, the remoteness of this spot, as an ideal opportunity to do away with the threat which Joseph posed. The opportunity for a perfect alibi was also at hand. Wild animals were a threat to life and limb in the open field. They need not even produce a body if they blamed Joseph's absence on his being devoured by wild beasts. Only a bloody robe needed to be presented to Jacob. His imagination would take care of the rest. Reuben had good reason to hate his brother, for it was Joseph who had obtained the birthright that could belong to him. But it seems Reuben feared facing his father more than he hated Joseph. He was still the oldest of the family, whether or not he had the rights of the firstborn. He was still saddled with the responsibilities. This may be an explanation for Reuben's suggestion and his intention to spare the life of Joseph. As a type of Christ, the cause of Joseph's rejection would most accurately be a refusal to submit to the authority of the one who threatened personal power and prestige. Joseph was rejected by his brethren because he deeply resented and was jealous of the authority his father had granted over him and over them, especially when they reasoned it should have been theirs. They were older. Was this not the very root reason for the rejection of Jesus by the religious leaders of his day? When Jesus taught the people, the response of the masses was significant. The result was that Jesus finished his words. The multitudes were amazed at his teaching. He was teaching them He was teaching as one having authority, and not as their scribes. All these lines of evidence lead us to the same conclusion. Joseph was rejected by his brethren because he, the youngest of these men, except save Benjamin of course, was placed in a position of authority over them. This rejection of Joseph's authority, coupled with the spectre of even greater preeminence as foreshadowed by his dreams, led them to conclude they must do away with him in order to protect their own position. So what was the real cause of their hatred? Basically caused by jealousy. They recognized there was an element of truth in Joseph's dreams. They saw their father's favoritism towards him, and they wanted that same sort of love and acceptance for themselves. Jealousy is a terrible thing. James 5:16 says, "Where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder and every kind of evil thing." This was certainly evident in the case of the brothers of Joseph. They were filled with jealousy and would eventually turn to a desire for murder. Jealousy says, "I want to have what you have, no matter what it costs you." Love says, "I want to have whatever is best for you, no matter what it costs me." The first case of jealousy in the Bible, remember, is seen in the instance of Cain and Abel. It was a case of acceptance and rejection from God. God accepted Abel's offering while rejecting Cain's offering. The result? Cain became jealous. It was not long before that jealousy turned to murder. The same was about to happen with the brothers of Joseph. Reuben, the oldest, persuaded him to throw Joseph into a pit rather than kill him. He secretly planned to come back and rescue Joseph. They took Joseph's coat, threw him into a pit, and then sat down to eat. How cosy. These brothers were mean, really mean. The slaughter of the Shechemites was only one evidence of their brutal natures. Reuben therefore suggested they kill Joseph without shedding of blood. They throw the boy in the cistern, let nature do him in. The idea had some definite advantages, and so the plan was agreed. When Joseph arrived, his reception was far from friendly. They tore off his coat, the symbol of all they rejected, and threw the defenceless young man into a pit. It is significant the pit was empty, for normally it would have contained water. If this had been the case, Joseph would have drowned before the Ishmaelite caravan had arrived. Even the empty pit was part of God's providential care for Joseph and his brothers. A pit, the original word is sometimes rendered cistern, a term applied to hollow reservoirs excavated out of solid rock for the purpose of holding rainwater, or to natural cavities containing fountains which were often walled up with stone to prevent the water from escaping, Bush says. When a caravan of Ishmaelites approached, Judah suggests that they could sell Joseph as a slave. The Ishmaelites bought Joseph and took him to Egypt. In order to explain his disappearance, they dipped Joseph's coat in the goat's blood and sent it back to the father. The callousness and cruelty of Joseph's brothers is almost unbelievable. Then they sat down to eat a meal. As they raised their eyes and looked, behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites were coming from Gilead, with their camels bearing aromatic gum and balm and myrrh on their way to bring them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it for us to kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and not lay our hands on him. He is our brother, he is our own flesh." Then some midnight traders passed by, so they pulled him up and lifted Joseph out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. Thus they brought Joseph into Egypt. Reuben returned to the pit. He must have been away looking after the sheep when this deal with the Ishmaelites were seen, and Joseph was not in the pit, so he tore his garments. He returned to his brother and says, "The boy is not there. As for me, where am I going to go?" So they took Joseph's coat and slaughtered a male goat and dipped the tunic in blood. They sent the varicolored tunic and brought it to their father and said, "We found this. Please examine it to see whether it is your son's tunic or not." Having thrown Joseph in the pit, they sat down to eat a meal. There's no loss of appetite, no sense of guilt or remorse, no pity, for they eat their meal probably well within hearing of the cries that were continually to come from the bottom of the pit. We can almost hear one of the brothers raise his voice over the petitions of Joseph and say to one of the others, "Want to trade a mutton sandwich for a bit of cheese?" Only later would these cries haunt the sons of Jacob. While they were eating, a caravan of Ishmaelites approached them on the way to Egypt from Gilead. This gave Judah an idea which would prevent the shedding of Joseph's blood altogether. Rather than having Joseph die of starvation and exposure, why not sell him to slavery? Why not make a profit with these traders? This would dispose of the problem, avoid the messy matter of murder, get rid of any evidence of wrongdoing, and perhaps, most appealing, it would provide him with a profit. There was no real virtue in Judah's proposal to his brothers. While Reuben sought to return Joseph to his father, Judah is not said to have any such intention. He didn't question the ethics or desirability of Joseph's murder, only the benefits. Profit was the one word which best summarized Judah's motivation. While slavery may seem to be a more humane fate than death, some who lived in such a state of slavery might challenge this fact. Selling a brother as a slave was hardly more commendable than putting him to death. In the end, Joseph was sold to midnight traders for 20 shekels of silver, the price which Moses later fixed for a young slave boy. The law of Moses set a price of 30 pieces of silver to redeem a disabled or killed slave. The alternation of the names Ishmaelite and Midianites in Genesis 37 and Genesis 39 is seen by many commentators as another example of a Bible mistake. Rather than being a mistake, they were synonymous or overlapping terms, even if no other evidence confirmed it. It is in fact settled by Judges chapter 8 verse 24, which says of the Midianites, they had golden earrings. Why? Because they were Ishmaelites. It's a classic example of a situation where, when we think we've found a Bible contradiction, we really only need to read on in order to find a solution to the problem. Reuben had been gone during the time his brothers sold Joseph to the traders. Very likely this was to distract their attention from Joseph in the hope of their leaving him quickly so he could return to rescue Joseph. What a shock it must have been for him to return to the dry cistern and find Joseph gone. Reuben, as the oldest son, is the one who must face his father, and that to him is not a very pleasant thought. Not only were Joseph's brothers completely aloof to his suffering, but also they almost seemed to delight in the suffering that the report would bring to their father Jacob. There's no gentle approach, no careful preparation for the tragic news, only the crude act of sending the bloody coat to him and letting him draw the desired conclusion. It was a heartless deed, but one that accurately depicted their spiritual condition at this time. Like most of us, Jacob jumped to a conclusion assuming the very worst had happened. Then he examined and said, "It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him." Joseph had surely been torn to pieces, so Jacob tore his clothes and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his sons many days. Then all of his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "Surely I will go down to Shiloh in mourning for my son." So his father wept for him. It was of course his son's tunic, for there was none other like it, and it was covered with blood. Such a blood-stained garment without a body led Jacob to the conclusion his sons desired. Joseph must have been attacked, devoured by a wild animal. Perhaps the brothers of Joseph prided themselves in the fact that they never said Joseph was dead. They simply deceived their father into believing it. Isn't it ironic that this deception involved the killing of a goat, just as the deception of Isaac had when he got the meal? Jacob seemed to handle the birthright. Jacob seemed to handle the death of Deborah and Rachel with a fair degree of composure, but the death of Joseph simply overcame him. There's no way his children could comfort him. How hypocritical these efforts must have been anyway. Life for Jacob seemed hardly worth living any longer. The only thing Jacob could look forward to was the grave. For many years Jacob would live with the lie that his son was dead. While Jacob was crying, "Woe is me," God was working all things together for the good of Jacob, Joseph, and his wayward brothers. Joseph, in fact, was not dead, nor was he outside the providential care of God. The Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the king of the bodyguard. Joseph ended up in the home of one of the most responsible officers of Pharaoh's administration. While years would pass by before God's purposes would become fully known, yet the process was underway. Contextually and historically, the sale of Joseph into slavery explains how Joseph and ultimately the entire nation of Israel ended up in Egypt, from whence the Exodus commenced. More importantly, this chapter tells us a good part of the reason why it was necessary for the time of bondage to occur. The fact that this bondage would take place was no mystery, for God had revealed already to Abraham. God had said to Abraham, "Know for certainty your descendants will be strangers in a land, it's not theirs. They will be enslaved and they will be oppressed. He will also judge the nation where they will serve, and afterwards they'll come out with many possessions." Spiritually, the state of the sons of Israel was at that time low. Nowhere have we yet seen any kind of relationship really with God, such as that of their forefathers. Internally, there's no unity among the brothers. They're simply sons of four different mothers, perpetuating the strife which existed between them. No brotherly love, only the seeking of self-interest. There's no better way to stimulate unity than through persecution. A brotherly quarrel is quickly forgotten. Family unity is intensified when outside opposition is introduced. 400 years spent among the Canaanites and Egyptians who despised Hebrews developed and strengthened the cohesiveness of these tribes of Israel. Later on in the story of Joseph and his brothers, Joseph will test them in this matter of family unity. He will offer them the opportunity of gaining their freedom from the expedient sacrifice of the youngest brother. They then showed a change of heart, which greatly encouraged and touched Joseph. Joseph was 70 years old when he was sold into slavery. He was raised to a position of power under Pharaoh at age 30. 7 years of plenty had already passed and 2 years of famine gone by before Joseph revealed his identity to his brothers. Joseph was therefore about 39 when he revealed his identity to his brothers, so 22 years had elapsed since his brothers had sold him into slavery. Doctrinally, we gain insight into several key biblical truths. First, we are reminded of the teaching of the Scripture on the matter of election, or chosen for service. It's almost unbelievable to think the roots of Israel's race religion go back to men such as these brothers, who have conspired to do away with their own flesh and blood. In the 9th chapter of Romans, Paul taught that election is not based upon the works which a person has done or will do in the future. God chooses to use men in service. Nearly everyone else in the land of Canaan would have been as qualified, or more so, than these cruel and wicked men. Most pagans have a deeper sense of family loyalty than this. Furthermore, the doctrine of the sovereignty of God and foreknowledge of God is easily seen in these chapters, as in Romans is summarized by these words. We know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. People are chosen for service, not for salvation. In the book of Ephesians, Paul has written, also we have obtained an inheritance which has been predestined according to his purpose, who works all things after the counsel of his will. God had purposed and promised to bring about the fulfillment of his promises to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, through these sons. Neither Jacob nor Joseph nor Jacob's other sons, not even Pharaoh himself, could prevent or even delay the sovereign purposes of the God of Israel. The means by which God employed to accomplish his will is seen in the doctrine of the providence of God. In simplest terms, the providential rule of God is the working out of his plan through sinful and willful men, even when they are actively striving to resist him and his purposes. All the while, God remains sovereign and in full control. He knows the beginning from the end. He assumes none of the guilt or responsibility for man's sins because of man's free will. Man must bear the full weight of responsibility for his actions. The providence of God is not his preferred plan of action, but a backup system which assures the fulfillment of his eternal purposes. Ideally, God works through believing men and women who will do his will, as expressed through his word. When believers or unbelievers choose to resist the will and the word of God, he resorts to this secondary system. It is decidedly less desirable to willful obedience and submission, for the wayward one always faces the consequences of disobedience and fails to find the joy and fulfillment which should come from obedience. The joy of actively and joyfully participating in the plan and work of God is lost. God's work goes on, but often we are unaware of it. Just as Jacob and the brothers of Joseph were ignorant to the hand of God and what was taking place, God is never handicapped by man's sin and disobedience. We are always hurt by it. That's why Apostle James wrote centuries later, consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. Let the endurance have its perfect result, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. The writer to Hebrews has said nearly the same thing in more extensive terms in Hebrews 12, and indeed the entire letter. A discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful but sorrowful, yet to those who have been trained by it, afterwards it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. On the one hand, the suffering which you observe in the lives of Jacob, Joseph and his brothers is needless. It's the result of sin. Yet God uses their sin and suffering and makes them a part of the gracious dealings and discipline of God to bring these men to himself and ultimately maturity. In the midst of our suffering, this is most often not seen, because the truth is veiled by our tears. But in the end, The result of suffering is faith, maturity, and joy. And so it was to be for Jacob and his sons. And so it is for every child of God. There's an interesting analogy between Abraham and Jacob. Both of them were called upon to give up their beloved sons. Abraham did so voluntarily and actively. Jacob, unknowingly, begrudgingly. Both sons were given back to them. It was through these sons whom these fathers gave up that the future of the fathers was secured. Throughout the scriptures, salvation is never secured without great sacrifice. As it was with Abraham, so it was with Jacob also. These two incidents only prepare us for the greatest sacrifice of all, when God the Father gave up his Son, Jesus Christ, for our salvation. As Joseph was rejected by his brethren and humiliated by slavery and imprisonment, so Jesus Christ was rejected by the Jewish leaders and his brethren and crucified on a Roman cross amongst criminals. Through the suffering of Joseph, Jacob and his sons were spared from the ravages of a severe famine. Through the sufferings of our Lord Jesus, those who trust in him are spared from the eternal wrath of God. There is a striking parallel here between the actions of Jacob's sons in deceiving their father and in Jacob's own actions some 30 years earlier, when he deceived his own father. Jacob had deliberately deceived Isaac into giving him the blessing. An article of clothing is used in the deception. Jacob wraps his arms around his head in wool to simulate the hairy arms and back of Esau. Jacob deceived his father with the skin of a dead goat. Jacob's sons deceived Jacob, deliberately deceive him into thinking Joseph was dead. An article of clothing is used in deception. The brothers dipped Joseph's tunic in blood to simulate Joseph's torn body, and Jacob's sons deceive him with the blood of a dead goat. There is a lesson here. It is that the sins of the parents are often repeated by the children. No doubt they had heard the story of how their father had deceived his father. While I doubt that they consciously were following in their father's footsteps, there is nevertheless a repeating of the old sin. And all his sons and daughters rose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. I shall go down to the grave to my son in mourning. Thus the father wept for him. Life is not always nice. God has not promised us easy living that is free from hardships. He has promised us that he will work all things for good to those who love him and are called according to his purpose. This story illustrates the providence of God in action. God had a plan. It was both a short-term as well as a long-range plan. It also means when you face hard times in the future, you can know God's hand is there even when you cannot see it. The story of Joseph reminds us of the story of our own spiritual brother Jesus Christ. Joseph, beloved by his father, hated by his brothers, sent to find his brothers plotted to murder him. He was sold for 20 shekels of silver. The blood of a goat served as a sign of his death. Jesus, loved by his father, is my beloved son in whom I am well pleased. He came to his own, and those who were his own didn't receive him. He was sent to save mankind. His fellow Jews plotted to murder him. He was betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. His own shed blood is a sign of his death. The difference between these two is that Jesus gave his life willingly for us. He is a son who volunteered to give his own life as a ransom for others. He did so that we might be freed from the slavery of sin. If you've got anything out of this passage, please feel free to come back and join us once again. Every blessing.